Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. The seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Welcome, listeners and viewers from America and across the world. I appreciate you taking the time to join me this evening. It is the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and a very dark and somber day for not only America, but the entire world. It was the moment when everything, the whole entire reality and the peace and comfort of all citizens across the earthen plane was put into jeopardy. And it was the second which the Illuminists, the New World Order elites, declared conquest and a change in direction for the fate and destiny of all of humanity. It was their declaration of what would be a sinister and deeply evil agenda of never-ending war and the stripping of habeas corpus rights for citizens worldwide. It was the moment when the darker aspects of what has been outlawed, technique, torture, disappearance, extraordinary rendition, became acceptable practice to intelligence agencies and CIA operatives across the Middle East and in other aspects of third world, war-torn countries where kidnapping became acceptable and black ops sites where people can be held off the books and off the record and be tortured indefinitely, even to the point of death, that these kind of practices could be repeated over and over. And very inhumane and evil exposure to cold and heat, darkness and noise, the deprivation, sleep deprivation, food, waterboarding is just the tip of what they declare to be part of these extraordinary measures. We have no idea, but if you read the reports, even the Red Cross reports that came out of places like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, the kinds of practices which normal, what used to be just military individuals serving in the military police, that they were authorized to do, the practices that they implemented against people that had nothing to do with the so-called terrorist attacks of that day, that examining and looking at the events which unfolded, of which we will speak about somewhat this evening, that there's no way that 19 terrorists who were on the payroll of the CIA and that were smuggled into the country and given passports and trained in a facade to make them patsies for these so-called events could ever have pulled it off in the manner that our government claims they did. And the craziest thing about the official story is that 9 of the so-called hijackers were still alive and doing well in other countries. And nobody ever says a word about that. And they have alibis for not having been part of the unfolding events of those days. The miracle passport with fingered Muhammad Atta, and that supposedly survived the burning wreckage of the plane that hit the north and south towers of the World Trade Centers and which brought them down in free fall flash in 11 seconds. I mean, even if you have steel and fires which rage hot enough to, steel just does not melt, and you cannot get burning jet fuel to a high enough temperature where it would even compromise or even melt in any manner the steel shell of the World Trade Centers, which, for those that don't know about how they were built, the World Trade Centers were extraordinarily strong. Not only did they have a steel reinforced core, but the outer perimeter, the outer skin of what became the steel girders of the outside portion of the structures were all still reinforced steel. And so the depiction of the supposed plastic nose piece of these jetliners smashing in and through the World Trade Centers without there being any kind of debris is another impossibility. And then the fact that you have multiple buildings. Not only did World Trade Center 1 and 2 go down in free fall fashion, as we have all witnessed and seen on the reportings of all of the mainstream news channels that were showing coverage and burning into the minds of humanity the so-called planes hitting the towers over and over and over. And then the official story, all of these supposed eyewitnesses declaring, that it was a terrorist attack and that Al Qaeda was to blame. Looking into the events of that day again and having now 17 years to consider the possibilities of what really truly occurred on that day, we know without a doubt that the official narrative is false. And that even if jet airliners were responsible for the melting and the weakening and the collapse of World Trade Centers 1 and 2, first off, there's no possible way it would have occurred in the manner that we were witness to, with the buildings coming down in free fall fashion and all collapsing in on their own footprint in 11 seconds flat. No possibility. And then what we saw of the concrete that was built upon and girded to the steel reinforced exterior and core, there's no explanation which would, cause the concrete to burn and then turn into dust. But the fact that we had two other buildings, Building 6 and Building 7 of the World Trade Centers, also go down on that day in similar fashion, when they had never been hit by jet airliner. Well, how do you explain that? Is that the residual effects of the so-called aftermath of these two planes causing the two giant towers to go down, that somehow they just also collapsed into their own footprint and disappeared to nothingness? Does that in any manner make any sense to anybody? No. And anybody with any kind of common sense, examining and reviewing the aftermath, the destruction, and what we see of what was the explosions and the controlled demolition of those buildings, that when you look at and see how other buildings are took down by these demolition crews, there's no differentiation. And when you consider that as the possibility for how and why these buildings ended up disappearing, well, then you know without a shadow of a doubt that 19 so-called Muslim hijackers, under orders of Osama bin Laden, who was a diabetic and going through kidney failure and having need for dialysis, that he could have orchestrated the events with a satellite phone from some cave in Afghanistan. It's absolutely preposterous. And how anybody could believe and still accept such fairy tale is just absolutely beyond me. And so, for myself, as I know it was for many of you, 9/11 was the catalyst which stirred emotionally, that heart wrenched. It forced me to seek out the truth of what truly occurred that day. And in doing so, I've come to know more than I ever thought possible of what some force was capable of engineering, and that it showed to me truly what Paul references in Ephesians 6 as we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities, rulers of darkness and wickedness in high places. That something more was going on than what we were privy to understand before the events of that day. And that the eye at the top of the Illuminati pyramid, which was imprinted upon the currency of all the money that we have been utilizing for since the time of the implementation of the Federal Reserve System, that money is printed and loaned to our governments at interest, and that the true power behind the Ponzi scheme of what is basically monopoly money, that that eye represents Satan, the adversary of humanity. And that unless we come to reason that truly there is a spiritual mechanism to the war against humanity, and what we see even in this day and age being fomented, such as the chemtrails and the mass destruction of generations of humanity through the vaccines and the fluoride, the fracking, and now these direct energy weapons, which was another thing that we initially saw evidence of during the events of 9/11, that Dr. Judy Woods reported in her book and showed to us on how the towers went down, or I don't remember the exact title now, but that there's no way to explain what we see as the complete melting of vehicles, cars, the steel being just turned to molten, and aluminum rims and rubber just completely burned up, glass shattered. We even saw a picture of uh, a fire truck that the front of it was completely melted off. That how do you explain things like that unless you open yourself to the possibility that again something more is going on than what we know and are being told. And this, in my opinion, is also connected to what we see as the destruction of California as the breadbasket of the world. That because so much food is grown there, and that there was a plan to bring America to her knees and to cause the American people to cause mass starvation on a grand scale, that there has been a military option to cause what we see as a decade-long drought. in California, and that the chemtrails are most certainly a part of that. But now we also see evidence of in those fires and the huge number of them, the destruction of homes in the middle of what are parking lots, and how there is still vegetation, trees and bushes and flowers which remain completely unharmed, and that there's no path for a wildfire to have raged up to and to have caused the destruction of so many of these homes and businesses and towns and cities. And weirdly, you have in a neighborhood 3/4 of the houses destroyed, and then oddly, one or two, three or four completely left untouched. It makes no sense. And so that's another thing to consider when tying together the events of 9/11 and the repercussions of that day to what we see occurring even now. And then the other thing that is connected to the events and the support that the terrorist group Al Qaeda received during the so called invasion of Afghanistan, which it's interesting also that the US military, after the so called, surprise attacks of September 11th, that they were already in position, that military assets had been moved 6 months in advance and put into place in order to start the immediate bombing and invasions of both Afghanistan and Iraq once they were fingered for being supporters and loyal to these terrorist groups. That somehow the military had spent millions of dollars in expenditure and effort to just coincidentally put into place all of what they needed to start the immediate ground war against these countries. That somebody in the Pentagon was a mind reader, and that same somebody or group or whoever connected to them, that they were somehow able to warn and to put into place FEMA on September 10th and send them to New York in preparation for the terrorist attacks of the very next day. And that the public relations people of the different airlines, United and American, which would have their planes so-called, even though they weren't on the manifest to actually have outgoing flights for that day, the particular planes, United 77 and 175, and the different planes that were said to be hijacked, they had their PR groups prepared to handle questions and to do interviews with the different media conglomerates, which would, on the very next day, show us these so-called hijacked airliners crashing into the World Trade Centers and supposedly into the Pentagon when yet there was no evidence of a downed airliner having hit or run into or smashed into the Pentagon, which curiously was undergoing renovations and had its east wing, the side which just so happened to be hit by this so-called terrorist hijacked plane. And that, interestingly enough, is the wing where all of the records for the $8.8 trillion of which Donald Rumsfeld on the day before said had mysteriously disappeared from the Pentagon's budget, and of which they had no record as to where it had all gone, that those records were also coincidentally, of course, held in the east side of the Pentagon that was smashed into and burned up, and conveniently all those records lost. And there was never an audit or a second question brought up as to where all that money went. Nobody was held to account. Nobody fired. Nobody even reprimanded for the disappearance of all that money. And now the Pentagon basically every year tells us that trillions of dollars just every year just disappear from the Pentagon budget. And nobody knows where it goes, what happened to it, and nobody is ever held to account, and nobody ever reprimanded. It's absolutely ridiculous the way that this country is allowed to be continued to be run. That now, you know, America being $20 trillion in debt, that this money over the course of one decade of Pentagon misappropriation could have went to pay for and to cover all of that, and yet nothing is ever brought up in the media, no story ever run, no investigative reporter ever questioning. It all just remains hush hush. Another thing, and the reason I had brought up Al Qaeda is because, for those that don't know, it was revealed, Seymour Hersh revealed that when the special forces that were sent into Afghanistan in order to take out supposedly Osama bin Laden and the Taliban and the Al Qaeda assets that were said to be given refuge there in that country, conveniently, right before they were about to be captured, the U.S. military sends in C-130s to fly them to Pakistan and safe refuge. And that's mainstream news. You can look it up for yourself. And when Seymour Hersh asked, how is it that the U.S. military, one wing of it, some other arm of it, would provide safe refuge to the very terrorists that they were supposedly after, and Osama bin Laden being the most wanted person in American history for orchestrating supposedly the terrorist attacks of that day. And also on the same day, the occurrences of those events, when all of the other airline traffic was grounded, his family was allowed by the president to fly out of our country and to safe refuge at a time when no other air traffic was allowed to leave the ground. All of the bin Ladens and the family that were here in the United States were allowed to fly out to safety. And that was reported in Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Moore and covered in great detail. And he also talked about how George Bush was given millions of dollars to create his first company, an oil company, from the bin Laden family, and that they were business partners and very close friends. And yet none of that was ever reported by mainstream news and the so-called pundits in Washington. And so the weirdness of all of these things, when you consider them, how can anybody believe and buy into the official story? And how can the American people in this day and age, here's almost 2 decades after the fact, still believe the official narrative? I watched a portion of the 9/11 memorial remembrance that took place yesterday morning. And they rung the bell as they read all the names of all the people that were killed when those buildings were imploded upon themselves. When it was reported over the intercom system that everything was fine, just go back to your offices. And many people did. And, before that time, there had never, ever in the history of fire ever did a steel reinforced concrete building collapse due to fire. Never. It had never occurred. And, this was also affirmed in Venezuela. You had a large fire which was burning even more, in greater rage than what we see evidenced by even the 9/11, the emergency, the tapes that were released of the conversations between the different emergency crews, that the firefighters that had made it up to I believe it was the 77th floor, where the so-called airplane, the airliner, had smashed into the side of the north and south tower, and then somehow its plastic nose cone was able to breach the steel reinforced exterior of the World Trade Centers, and its wings somehow just folded inward, and it created this gaping hole, and fires that were so tremendously hot initially that people were leaping to their deaths, that after an hour of this so-called jet fuel burning, that the firefighters reported isolated pockets of smoldering fires, and that they could get them knocked down pretty easy with a couple of lines of water. And yet, suddenly thereafter, and at a time when Rudy Giuliani was told to leave the Office of Emergency Management, which was located in World Trade Center 7, because the building was somehow going to go down when it yet was not and had not been hit by any airliner. He reported this on ABC News with Peter Jennings, described how he was told to exit the building because it was going to come down, and yet he didn't take into consideration sharing this knowledge with any of the emergency workers and the firefighters, the police officers, and the ambulance crews which were entering into those buildings and which were crushed to death by the implosions. And again, some of these buildings, World Trade Center 6 and 7, and they had not been hit by any airliner. And there was no reason for them. You know, World Trade Center 7 was a 47-story building that disappeared in 11 seconds and then imploded into its own footprint. And again, never in the history of fire. Even now there's a group which, if you haven't heard of them, I highly recommend that you listen to, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, of which I just posted a link to a video where they are calling for a true and relevant investigation of the occurrence of those days. And even though it was the greatest criminal act and terrorist event to ever have taken place here in America, Rudy Giuliani, the same one that said that he had been told that the buildings would come down and that he should get out of World Trade Center 7, America's mayor, I call him the September criminal, he spoke about and authorized the immediate removal of the debris, the World Trade Center debris, and effectively disappeared and corrupted, which should be a treasonous act, the crime scene of those particular buildings and of what had happened on that day. And interestingly enough, they had put GPS trackers on all of the dump trucks which were hired to haul out and to place on barge all of this steel and these girders that just happened to conveniently be cut to perfect size to then be hauled off. And all of this steel and all of the remnants of that destruction were sold off cheaply to China and conveniently transported out of country and eradicated so completely that no investigation was ever held. How is that not criminal? I mean, it makes me sick. Even this far away from what occurred on that day. As an American citizen, it just makes me want to puke that they were able to get away with, and nobody was found criminally negligent or officially indicted for what occurred on that day. Here's another something to consider. Marvin Bush, George Bush's cousin, was the head of security for the World Trade Centers, and that never in the history of those buildings had any time the security cameras gone down. And yet you have reported 6 months or so prior to this event that there was a time when all of the security cameras and the security detail for the World Trade Centers were removed and emptied. And in my opinion, it was during that time that the explosive material, which was put into place to later bring down these buildings in the horrific fashion that we saw, with girders being expelled and blown out, exploded out, heavy steel reinforced girders launched, exploded away from the buildings, and raining down this debris upon other buildings and smashing them, that they were put into place. It's the only explanation that makes any kind of sense. And that some new technology called thermite was also utilized and put into place in order to cut in precision the girders into, as I said, conveniently the exact length necessary to be hauled away by these dump trucks after the buildings came down on those days. I mean, you can't construct a narrative in Hollywood that is more bizarre than what we have now come to learn about what happened on those days. And then, the EPA, I forget the lady's name right now. It's been a while, but the Environmental Protection Agency coming out and say that the air quality was fine, and that the emergency workers that went in to help save lives and to also clean up the debris field and to help disappear the evidence of that crime scene, they were told that the air quality was safe and that nothing would occur which would be detrimental to their health. And we've seen now that many of these emergency workers have since passed away and had their health compromised. And sadly, they were even refused medical assistance, health insurance coverage, and forced to die like those individuals, the Tuskegee Airmen, which were purposely given syphilis and then monitored and allowed to die horrific death. I mean, the evil nature of our government and why anybody would trust what they say still to this day. How the majority of the American people in the world would buy into and believe what they say. And it's because of the ignorance and the complacency of the American people that they are able to still dupe and to trick us into supporting wars of conquest. And we are at some point going to pay for allowing them to use such doublespeak to trick us into supporting the destruction of other peoples and nations. And in my opinion, what we see going down in Syria right now, with what will be the invasion of Idlib and Russia and Turkey and the Bashar Assad government that is being propped up by them and supported by them, and they're going after the ISIS and Al Qaeda forces, which America has been supporting since the days of the wars of Russia and Afghanistan and the establishment of these terrorist elements by the Pakistani ISI with CIA money, that we're going to bear the repercussions of that at some day, because the writing's on the wall. Just like when the Most High told Nebuchadnezzar's son, I forget his name, but when they pulled out the temple implements, the holy artifacts stolen from the holy temple, and used them to toast and celebrate their Babylonian empire and the destruction, the exile of the Hebrew people at that time. The writing was on the wall that in that same day, and what would be later that evening, the kingdom would be rent and taken away from him. And indeed, the Persian forces snuck in through the river systems that flowed under the city and took over and destroyed Babylon. And the writing's on the wall for us too, because, and even right now, there's supposedly 10,000 Americans and British forces caught. They were advisors to the ISIS and Al Qaeda elements in Syria, which were utilizing and fingering and trying to false flag, that were pulling off false flag chemical events and blaming it on the Bashar Assad government as pretext for the bombing of the Syrian military assets in that country. And that this has also been used as pretext by Israel to bomb Iranian and other assets in the Middle East. And what they want is a major global involvement in a war which will destroy the Western nations and raise up the communist, atheist, nihilists which rule in China and Russia as the Gog and Magog alignment against Israel, spoken of in Ezekiel. That this biblical prophetic war and the destruction of Damascus is all taking place right now. And we're at the precipice. We're at the apex for this unfolding. And what we don't understand is that the war is being orchestrated. The so-called, line that has been drawn, and the Russian support of Bashar al-Assad, and American and British and French and NATO support of the terrorist elements of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and whatever else names they've given to the rebels that have been armed and which are killing and beheading and decimating Christian peoples living in these areas, and which have caused millions of people to now be refugees and having to flee their native homelands there in the Middle East, was described by Albert Pike in vision, going all the way back to
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this.
That he described the... Okay, welcome back, everyone. I apologize there. I think I let it go a little bit too long, but as I stated previously, we're not able to tell when the commercials are over. And so anyways, I was speaking about, before we went to the break, about what's going on in Syria and how right now there is about to be a campaign that Russia, Turkey, and also the Syrian military, they are going to go into and eradicate the 10,000 terrorists which have been funded and supplied and also advised in official capacity by the U.S. military, and how this could be the catalyst for what we see revealed by Albert Pike as the hedge for bringing forth a wider, broader war between nations, and specifically the Christian and Muslim countries and the two sides which support these different faiths. And that what Albert Pike described and what they had wanted, even with the recreation of Israel after the establishment of the United Nations as the seat of world government, is to cause what in Scripture is prophetically spoken of as by Zechariah as Jerusalem being a cup of trembling amongst the nations, that it would be a source of irritation and agitation, and it would drive and create and foment the catalyst for what would be a broader and worldwide conflict between nations. And specifically, Pike mentions and speaks about how the division between the Zionists and the extremist Muslim fanatical terrorists, that it would be this conflict and this division, which historically and biblically goes back to the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, spoken of in Genesis 3:15, and which would also be connected to what we see of the division between the children of Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac. Isaac being the seed of promise and Ishmael being a seed of pleasure, that this conflict between these two brothers would be ongoing and would continue unabated, even to what we see as the wars between the children of Jacob and the children of Esau, or what is also described in Scripture as the conflict between the Gentiles and the Jews, or the olive tree and the wild branch, or the goat and the sheep, the wheat and the tares, the good figs, the bad figs. It's the same thing. Those on the left from those on the right. Those that follow the broad path of destruction and the road to perdition, and those that follow the narrow way. And so this is the same conflict being orchestrated, that the elites create and establish minorities and the division of peoples, and then agitate the differences between them in order to drive them to conflict with one another. And historically, they have funded and armed both sides in order to profit off of such engagements. And they have utilized this modus operandi over and over repeatedly. Look how much has been spent on war and on the armament buildup since the events of 9/11. Look at how many people have been duped into joining both sides of the conflict. No matter which side you are supporting, you're just a tool. You're just cannon fodder. You're just expendable in the destruction of innocence. I'm going to share something that Stephanie posted in the Discord chat. She says that is after, well, let me read first what the previous comment. Yes, a spiritual awakening is the most important awakening we could ever hope to help bring about. They're total liars about everything, and they should not be trusted about anything. They are setting us up for a bloodbath. They go bomb the world under false pretense, murdering brown-skinned children wherever they find them. And now they want to bring all those devastated and rightfully angry people here. A recipe for disaster. I could not agree more. And so, continuing, she says, that is after they've been brainwashed, the typical football watching, movie star worshiping American, into believing they've got to fight all the terrorists. when really we're the terrorists. Muslims are still angry about the Crusades, referring to us as crusaders, infidels, I add. I suppose we have Rome to thank for that. And yes, we do. I mean, even Daniel, which in the show that I did and released about preterism just recently, I spoke about the parable of the fig tree and how it was that the end of days could only come about in our lifetimes, because it was during our lifetime that we see the gathering of the fig tree, the blooming of the fig tree occurring. And so there's no other time before now that these things could actually take place. And I want to share, since for those that may not be familiar, and I've shared it before, but it's so critical, it's so very important that I'm going to share it again. And that's Albert Pike's vision for the need for the Illuminati and the mafiosos to work together to orchestrate and bring about what is the three global conflicts as pretext to establish the world government and organization for controlling the affairs of nations, and that it would be this world recognized authority which would then bring forth the fulfillment of the Zionist efforts to recreate Israel, and that it would be the recreation of Israel which would then be allowed, and again, the Zechariah 12, the cup of trembling amongst the nations, that it would be the catalyst to then drive the world to war, and that they want to allow the Muslim and Christian nations to decimate each other so exhaustively and so completely that a power vacuum would be created, and then the communists and the nihilists, the atheists, would be allowed to come forth and take over that power, and then they would, for the grand finale, they would introduce the antichrist as the world's savior, and that they would bring to the forefront the worship of Lucifer finally out into public view. And yeah, I know it totally sounds crazy, but yet this is what is spoken about and revealed and told even in their own words, and in a description of the vision that Pike had, which absolutely, it's my opinion that he received it from Satan, no questions, because he was a willing prodigy, and this is indeed what occurred. And for these groups to be able to orchestrate and to drive the world to what was the manifestation of this vision just shows you to what extent and how much power they hold upon the masses. And again, these are the ones that, since the establishment of the Federal Reserve System and being able to print the money and loan it to especially our government, and that, you know, the American dollar has been the reserve currency of the world for 100 years, that with that authority and with the interest that was placed upon the debt burden upon the American people, and all of the money that has been filtered away, that money has been utilized to implement this vision. And when you have, basically an unending stream of money to do whatever you want to with, you can create and lead the world in direction to whatever it is you want to occur. And that's exactly what has happened. And that's a whole nother part of the deception which people need to wake up to. The fact that the Federal Reserve is a privately organized bank, and that these 13 Illuminati families, which hold control of the currencies of the world and which have established the central banks for which all the nations bow down to, and accepting currency as part of the mark of the beast system, we are all involved in the idolatrous worship of Satan, the economics, the stock markets. All of that is part of what is the economic debt slavery of all the people that have to slave to make money in order to survive in the general matrix that has been fomented and implemented and placed upon all the peoples of the world. So listen to this vision of the three wars. And these are just extracts of the letter, but they will bring up the main points. The First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati to overthrow the power of the czars in Russia and of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism. The divergences caused by the agenture or the agents of the Illuminati between the British and Germanic empires will be used to foment this war. At the end of the war, communism will be built up and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions of the world. The Second World War. The Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. During the Second World War, international communism must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would be then restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm. So here you see the highlights of the Second World War is that Nazism is on the outward appearance destroyed, and then Zionism allowed enough power to push for what would be the recreation of Israel, which is prophecy, which was written and told hundreds and even thousands of years before in the scriptures. And believe me, this is, well, don't believe me, go study it for yourself. But this is the regathering of Israel, is the blooming of the fig tree, stated and spoken about by Christ when the apostles asked him what would be the signs of your return and of the end of the age. And he told them, "Know ye the parable of the fig tree?" And Peter asked him specifically, "Tell us what the parable of the fig tree is. We know it not." And then he told them, "It is the regathering of the house of Israel." And we see that this event occurred in our lifetimes in 1948, almost a generation ago. And so we are those that would be alive according to him, that would see all prophecy being fulfilled. So, the third global war, let me pull it up. That one was kind of messed up. All right, the highlights were the text between the letter between Pike and Giuseppe Mazzini of the Third Global War. It says that the Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agents of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the Muslim Arabic world, and political Zionism, the state of Israel, mutually destroy each other. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained. Physical, moral, spiritual, and economical exhaustion. We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, the origin of savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere, the citizens, obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries, will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, and anxious for an idea but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out into the public view. This manifestation will result from the general reactionary movement, which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. And so, do you not see that this is exactly what is unfolding and being set up? And that the Muslim and the Zionist, those that support Israel, which is Christianity and Christendom, that this is the third Crusader war, and it's an ongoing destruction which will see the complete exhaustion. I mean, look at how much America is already in debt just fighting and supporting these wars of terror and on terror that Cheney said would not end in our lifetimes. We are so far in debt that billions of dollars are being paid every day just to keep down the interest on this debt. I mean, it's insane. That much money. I mean, you've seen the debt clock, it just, every second, it exponentially arises. And there's no way we're ever going to be able to pay it off. So our country and our people are perpetual debt slaves to those countries which are being empowered and made wealthy by the constructed downfall of America as empire. That Rome, in the same way, was disappeared and the Catholic Church established in power. The same thing is happening. That the power is being shifted to Russia and China. And these atheistic nations, which have outlawed any belief in God and have organized as their state, the belief of the state that there is no God and that there's no repercussions for the actions that we produce in our lifetime, that there's no judgment to be rendered for whether you are good or evil. What kind of destruction will a people that has no concern for their actions, what kind of insanity, what kind of bloodshed could be orchestrated by a godless people upon the innocence of others? You talk about murder, rape, pillage, and plunder. What we see described in Jeremiah 50 and 51 as the destruction of America, as the nation of unwalled villages, the hammer of the nations, which we once were, but our power is being destroyed. And we're being set up for a major downfall, the likes of which has never been before seen by the world. And if you read the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, they speak about what in Pike in his letter, the need for this social cataclysm. They speak about bringing this forth at a time, and that when it happens, that the atheists and their agentures will go on a bloody massacre. They will implement massacre, death, and destruction across the world. And the events of 9/11, that was the shot across the bow. That was the first declaration for those that are part and have allegiance to the New World Order as to what is coming. We released a book called The Secret Teachings of the Illuminati, something thereabouts. And in that book, I spoke about how all of this has been predicted and written about and prepared for hundreds, even thousands of years in advance. And that they are patient. The spiritual powers aligned against us, the eye at the top of the Illuminati pyramid. Satan has been carefully preparing these events to unfold and to take place, and that this will be his what will lead to the coming of the Antichrist. There have been people that have told us of those that are working in tangent together to bring forth this destruction, this conspiracy. It says that the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. I want to share with you a passage which talks about the moment that they have prepared. When the hour strikes for our sovereign Lord of all the world to be crowned, it is these same hands which will sweep away everything that might be a hindrance thereto. This is speaking about the coming of the Antichrist. Because as I said, these people, the bloodlines of the Illuminati, they worship their father, the devil. They are aligned to and dedicated and take blood oaths to bring forth the agenda of the New World Order. And so this is what is being prepared. And here it says, this hatred will be still further magnified by the effects of an economic crisis, which will stop dealing on the exchanges and bring industry to a standstill. We shall create by all the secret subterranean methods open to us, and with the aid of gold, which is all in our hands, a universal economic crisis whereby we shall throw upon the streets whole mobs of workers simultaneously in all the countries of Europe and the world. These mobs will rush delightfully to shed the blood of those whom, in the simplicity of their ignorance, they have envied from their cradles, and whose property they will then be able to loot. Ours they will not touch, because the moment of our attack will be known to us, and we shall take measures to protect our own. I mean, if that doesn't say it all, I I just don't know what else does. I want to continue just a little further. We have demonstrated that progress will bring all the goyim to the sovereignty of reason. Our despotism will be precisely that, for it will know how, by wise severities, to pacificate all unrest, to cauterize liberalism out of all institutions. When the populace has seen that all sorts of concessions and indulgences are yielded in the name of freedom, it has imagined itself to be sovereign lord and has stormed its way to power. But naturally, like every other blind man, it has come upon a host of stumbling blocks. It has rushed to find a guide it has never had the sense to return to the former state, and it has laid down its plenipotentiary powers at our feet. Remember the French Revolution, to which it was we, the Philadelphians, the Illuminati, who gave the name of great. The secrets of its preparations are well known to us, for it was wholly the work of our hands. Ever since that time, we have been leading the peoples from one disenchantment to another, so that in the end they should turn also from us in favor of the king despot of the blood of Zion, whom we are preparing for the world. See, this is again the Antichrist. They're speaking about how out of the order, out of chaos, out of the destruction of the fomentation of this global conflict between the Muslim and the Christian worlds, and even the power vacuum for which the atheists step in to fill, that the slaughter and the destruction that they bring forth will cause all the world's people to call for a Savior Messiah. And it will be the Antichrist that comes to power in this time to fulfill this role. At the present day, we are, as an international force, invincible, because if attacked by some, we are supported by other states. They're speaking about controlled opposition here. It is the bottomless rascality of the Goyim peoples, who crawl on their bellies to force, but are merciless towards weakness, unsparing to faults and indulgent to crimes, unwilling to bear the contradictions of a free social system, but patient unto martyrdom under the violence of a bold despotism. It is those qualities which are aiding us to independence. From the premier dictators of the present day, the Goyim people suffer patiently and bear such abuses as for the least of them they would have beheaded 20 kings. What is the explanation of this phenomena? This curious inconsequence of the masses of the peoples and their attitude towards what would appear to be events of the same order? It is explained by the fact that these dictators whisper to the peoples through their agents that through these abuses they are inflicting injury on the states with the highest purpose to secure the welfare of the peoples, the international brotherhood of them all, their solidarity and equality of rights. Naturally, they do not tell the peoples that this unification must be accomplished only under our sovereign rule. And so, the New World Order, that with the events of 9/11, you saw implemented the Patriot Act, the destruction of habeas corpus right, the implementation of torture, extraordinary rendition, disappearance, and basically state-sponsored murder. That these things were done and promoted and said to be necessary means by which the people of America would be protected. That in order for our freedoms to be maintained, we would have to give them up. And that we would have to wage war using these extraordinary means to shake out and to find the terrorists. And that the police and the intelligence agencies must be given the right to abuse their power in order to engage and to eradicate the boogeyman. And the American people bought it hook, line, and sinker, as did the rest of the world. And that's the sadness of the false left right paradigm, and why it's absolutely worthless to involve yourselves in the politics of today. because there is no difference in the Democratic or Republican branch of government. They are two sides of the same coin. They both serve the lobbyists, which serve the corporations, which serve the political elite, and which receive their dictates from the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, because these are the three true branches of government, the secret societies that are aligned and organized against the people, and which call us the useless goyim. They openly serve their Illuminati masters and call for the advancement of world government, and they have for a very long time. And these members, even though they are part of and ruling over and sitting on the power, the thrones, the presidencies, the prime ministerships of all the different nations of the world, they all bow down to their master, Satan, the eye, which directs and governs and controls the wealth, the power, and the kingdoms of this world. That we saw it even in the incarnation of Christ coming into the flesh. Satan offered him all the kingdoms of this world, took him to an exceedingly high place and said, if you would just bow and show me a little homage, I can give you the authority of all these nations. Because he truly had the power that controls and rules them all. But Christ told us that his kingdom is not of this world. And it's only because the Most High has established and given over to the angels, the rebel angels, the fallen angels, and to humanity, we as angels caught up in flesh form, free will to decide with our choice, with our decisions, with our behaviors, our action, our intent, our wishes, our prayers, what kind of world we would like to live in. And we see why now we need a sovereign Lord to rule over, to be a benevolent king, and to guide us in direction. Because if left up to our own devices, this is the kind of world we would create. We would support evil. We would allow ourselves to be duped into supporting controlled opposition. And we would allow angelic authorities and forces like Legion and Satan that have no love of humanity and no regard for the well-being of any child born into this realm. No concern, but only hungry for power, wealth, blood, and sacrifice. The Most High has given us this chance to try it on our own, to see exactly what we would create, and to learn through the knowledge of good and evil why it is we need his beneficence to guide and control all things. Because without him, there would be no order, no harmony. Without the triune Godhead of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, all things would be chaos and destruction. And things would be and get so bad that there would be no flesh left. I do pray for an awakening and that more and more people come to the truth of why it is we must be vigilant and why it is we must study and come to understand the gospel in the way that it has been laid out and revealed to us by the patriarchs, apostles, and prophets, which have served the Most High over time and generation. Because otherwise, truly, as it says in Scripture, my people would be killed for lack of knowledge. And that daily is happening on grand scale. It's because we do not understand the prophecy and even the vision of the statue of the empires which would come to power after Nebuchadnezzar's day, and of the interdiction with the daughters of Cain, the sons of humanity involvement, what we see as the alien abduction, and the spiritual influence of the demonic forces aligned against us in our everyday reality. That given the authority and the power, most of the world would be led astray to such degree that they would willingly involve themselves in evil and call it good. That they would wage war against their enemies and slaughter their children and bomb them from drone or assassinate them with bullet, as the CIA's. Christ said of this people, the seed of the serpent, that they were the murderers of the prophets from the time of Abel to Zacharias, the high priest, which was killed in the Holy of Holies during his lifetime. That they have been the murderers of the prophets and those that have been the messengers of truth all throughout time immemorial. And that it is still this way in this time, that they are murdering doctors and whistleblowers and people that speak out against every conspiracy being propagated and perpetuated against humanity, and which people are trying to bring you to better understand it and discernment upon. And yet still most of the world has no concern and no love of the truth. And it's for this reason that the greatest deception and the strongest delusion is about to come upon us. And those things which I spoke about this evening are just part of the setup for what will be the coming of the reign of the Antichrist and the establishment of the mark of the beast system. And even though I daily pray that none of us ever have to endure such struggle or to see such carnage, this is what is revealed in Scripture. And every word shall be fulfilled to every jot and tittle. And so I know these things are coming because we are the last generation. We are the fig tree generation, which would be alive to see all these things be fulfilled. And so the least we can do is prepare and to pray and to try to wake up as many as we can. And so that's what I'm doing.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back.
Well, I think we are at the end of the show. I am not sure if